Welcome everyone today to our second of the autumn seminars. Mireia Rodriguez is going to be talking about plant knowledge from Brazil in the 16th and 17th century. I just want to remind you of our practicalities here. Could you all please mute your computers now and turn off your videos so that we only have the video and the audio of the speakers introducing and giving the paper. As usual, we ask you to ask your questions via the chat box, and if you type them into the chat box, then during the talk or just at the end, then Pippa will pick them up and relay them to the speaker, and the speaker will address them. And I think that's all we have on any of the practical things. If there's anything that you have that I haven't covered, perhaps you could send us a little message in the chat if you've got any questions. But I think now we're ready to introduce our speaker. So, and Pippa Potts, one of the conveners, is going to do that. So over to you, Pippa. Pippa?
There. At our last seminar, we were looking at the transmission of plants and plant information from the Philippines to Europe in the 18th century. And as Michael Hans just said, this evening we're going back in time to the 17th century, and we're switching our attention to South America and specifically Brazil. And we're very fortunate to have as our speaker Mireia Alcantara Rodriguez, who's currently a PhD student at Leiden, where she's working on a collaborative European-funded project entitled Brasiliae, Indigenous Knowledge in the Making of Science, Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, 1648. There's a really logical progress for Mireia here, because her MSc dissertation at Utrecht also looked at the Historia, or HNB for short, but her postgrad search has also been about African plant legacy in the Caribbean, as well as the ethnoflora of the Colombian Andes, so a broad spectrum. But back to the subject in hand and research into the flora that the Dutch artists and botanists found and recorded in the early part of the 17th century. Mireia, it's a very great pleasure to welcome you. And the floor, as they say, is yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Pippa, for this kind introduction. Let me share the screen. Can you see the slides? All right. So, well, first of all, to tell you that I'm very happy to have been invited to this series of seminars. Well, I want to present you here a very valuable piece of Brazilian heritage. And considering that knowledge, and therefore plant knowledge, is heritage, let me introduce you plant knowledge depicted through the botanical identifications of 17th century illustrations of Dutch Brazil. So here, this is how all started for me, at least for my research. This is a cover of a collection of Brazilian illustrations of plants. So today, this is kept in Poland, but how this collection, this Brazilian collection, end up in there? So, well, in the 17th century, the northeastern territories of Brazil were colonized by the Dutch West India Company. So in 1636, they appointed as Governor General of the colony the Count Johan Maurits of Nassau, who arrived to Recife in January 1637. So Johan Maurits, besides his military and administrative duties, he had great ambitions to depict, to document all the natural elements that were found in the colony. So for this aim, first of all, he created his own city, which he called Maurits stad, which in Dutch means Maurits city. In this one, he also ordered to create very structured, very organized gardens with the aim of taming the wild nature that surrounds him. So he was bringing all kinds of plants like coconut trees, papayas, and others and planting them there. So this created sort of the conditions for the people that he brought with him to depict these natural elements and to document them. Also for these purposes, he assembled a team of scientists and naturalists. Among the scientists, we have physician Marcgrave Piso, and among the naturalists, George Marcgrave. Among the artists, the most well-known are the Dutch painters Albert Eekhout and Frans Post. However, it's believed that more painters were joining his retinue, but these are not acknowledged as these ones. So, well, some of the outcomes from all this colonial enterprise from Johan Maurits that I want to highlight in this presentation are, in one hand, textual sources that are used, and in another hand, the visual ones. So the textual sources are these books of natural history that you can see in the slide. We have the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae that was published in 1648 in Amsterdam by Elsevier. This book is probably some of you already know it, but in this book, there are descriptions and also good images of plants, of animals. There are also many descriptions of tropical diseases and so on. Piso is one of the authors. And then also we have George Marcgrave and Johannes de Laet, who was a cartographer and also one of the directors of the West India Company, took all the material that Johan Maurits handed to him, all these reports on plants and animals and so on, and he arranged it in this volume. However, 10 years later, Piso was not very happy about the arrangement and the content of the book, and Johannes de Laet was dead. Also, naturalist Marcgrave, he didn't even make it back to Europe. So he took some of the content of the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae and placed it in this book that is called In the Etrusci Naturali et Medica. He also used some of the same woodcuts and others he modified them. So for these reasons, he was accused of plagiarism, and there is a lot of controversy about this work that, however, was highly used for centuries and centuries by naturalists and people interested in the natural history of Brazil. Well, in the visual sources, we have a lot of illustrations, drawing, sketches, that when Johan Maurits came back to the Netherlands in 1644, he brought along. And of course, also a lot of naturalia, exotic rare naturalia, seeds, dry plants, and so on. So, but we are focusing in the illustrations. So in 1652, he took all these illustrations and gave them to Frederick William the Great as a diplomatic gift, who at the same time passed them to his physician in court, Christian Menzel. So Menzel spent some time arranging the content of these illustrations. And here you can see the result of one of them, this Theatrum Rerum Naturalium, which has the botanical illustrations, and it's in the material that I'm focusing myself as a botanist. But well, one way or another, this material was in the library of the lector, but this library later on was the library of the Prussian state, and today is the library that we know as the Library of Berlin, of the state of Berlin. However, in 1945, to protect this material from the bombings, this material was evacuated. And it ended up in one place and another, and it was thought to be lost for almost 3 decades. However, zoologist Peter Whitehead found it in 1977 in the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow, in Poland. And this is the story of the Theatrum Rerum Naturalium, and also of the rest of the drawings and illustrations that were brought with Johan Maurits from Brazil. So these collections, we have the Theatrum, we also have the Miscellanea Cleyeri and the Libri Principis. And all these three collections end up in the 19th century in a larger collection that we know as the Libri Picturati. So they have some differences among them. For example, the Theatrum, as you can observe, are all paintings. The Miscellanea Cleyeri is more like pencils, crayon, while the Libri Principis are watercolors or gouache. However, I'm going to focus myself in other differences or similarities that I will tell you in a bit. So, motivated by Valentina Pugliano, who once said, we are also told that the nature of the foreign was understood through its natural objects. What this nature was, we are often left to wonder. So I start wondering myself, actually, what are the plans behind these objects? Because although they got objectified through their depiction in an illustration, these plants can be located in nature and they have their own ecology, their own behavior, and their own characteristics. So I was really wondering what were these plants? What are they? So to know about this, I applied botanical image analysis to these historical collections. So to do so, first of all, I had to identify taxonomically what are all these plants. And for that, I compared it with contemporary material like Historia Naturalis. And I also rely on an amazing network of botanists and ethnobotanists in Brazil, in the Netherlands, Mexico, and all over the world who kindly help me with identifications when I have doubts. So, well, here I want to show you an example of, this is a cover of Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, and this is one of the woodcut images that we can find in the book. Now, if we see the images of the Theatrum, we find two illustrations, but actually these two illustrations belong to the same plant, which is the one represented in the woodcut. What happened is like they combine the fruits, they combine the flowers in one image. And as some scholars have stated before, this is for several reasons: to economize space, to save money, but more importantly, to convey as much botanical information as possible. Like, for example, we may find in Leonard Fuchs manuscripts from the 16th century. So, well, I want to share a bit of my results. One of the questions I had is where the plants come from. So, well, first of all, we have 234 illustrations within this collection of botanical images, and these belong to 198 taxa. May seem like a weird word. Taxa is a plural of taxon, and is simply what the unique species. So, for example, in this image, you have two illustrations, but there's only one taxon because they belong to one plant, the one that you can see in this image. So that's why we have less taxa than illustrations, because some illustrations represent the same plant, the same species. This is another example. This is a Miscellanea Cleyeri in this case. So we have some loose illustrations, loose drawings here. Apparently they don't tell much at the first sight. When we put them together, we solved the puzzle and we found out that this actually belonged to Fulcrea foetida, which is a plant that was introduced in Brazil, most likely by the Dutch, as they already knew it. I think they already grow it in the gardens in the Netherlands. And the thing is, that's why I look at the origin, because although most of the plants actually are from Brazil, we can say they are native from Brazil, there is also a percentage of plants that were introduced, like this one. And with this, we can trace the dispersion and distribution of these plants by human population or by other causes. For example, the illustration that you can see here, I'm sure all of you can recognize them. We have the lemon, the pomegranate, and the grapevine. So although these plants were depicted when the Dutch were occupying the colony, these were actually there much before, as the Portuguese, either merchants or the Jesuits, to use them in their boticas or pharmacies, they already brought them to Brazil. So they use them not only as food, but also medicinally. And then when the Dutch colonized the area, they probably applied the same uses. And there are accounts also in textual accounts that prove that these plants were actually growing in the gardens. These gardens that I told you that Maurits created in Recife around his city. So this plant here is really interesting because Guilandina Bonduc is the scientific name. In the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, it's called Inimoi, and also Silva da Praia in Portuguese. And it's really interesting because this plant comes from West Africa. And the reasons that was found at that time, the 1640s in Brazil, can be two. One, it could have been brought by the oceanic currents, because as you can see, it has these seeds that are rounded, so they can be transported by the oceans. However, there is another hypothesis that involves a more active agent. So these seeds are known to be for millennia being used, first in the Upper Nile in today's Sudan. If you can see here, the board, you can imagine that it was used for arithmetics. So it was like a calculator, let's say. They were using it for trading transactions. Later on, they start using it as a game. And today, in some regions in Africa and some countries, like in Ghana, actually, they are playing this game, which is called Oware. But then in the Caribbean, you found it as Wari, they call it Wari, that comes from Oware, and they still play the game. I left a link there, if you can follow this website, because it's a very interesting story that Christopher Drayton is narrating about the African heritage that has persisted since the colonization of, in this case, of the Caribbean. However, this plant was also found in Brazil in the 17th century, so the same story may relate in this case. Also, we have this plant, the sunflower, so I bet is familiar for all of you. Well, when I check about the history of the sunflower, I found out that this originated in North America or Mexico, and it was brought by the Spanish colonizers to Africa, where it thrived in the botanical gardens, like in the Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid. Then they exchanged material with their counterparts in the Netherlands. So it was growing at that time also in the Netherlands, and in some point, the Russians improved it genetically and start cultivating as a crop for its economic value. Now, I think we need to add another arrow to the map, because as the illustration proves, most likely this sunflower was growing actually in the gardens of Mauritsstad at that time, the 17th century. So it didn't arrive to Brazil in the 19th or 20th century, as I saw in some reports. It was there before. And interestingly enough, if you check out the illustration, actually has an annotation, which is the vernacular name, and it says Camaraguasu. Camaraguasu is a name that comes from the macrolinguistic Tupi family. This is one of the evidence that indigenous peoples at that time were familiar with the sunflower. So to me, it could have been the Portuguese who brought the sunflower. It could have been the Dutch, who were quite acquainted. They knew quite well this plant. Back then, in the 17th century, they were growing it in botanical gardens since the 16th century. However, we cannot dismiss that trade among indigenous peoples existed and involved also the sunflower. We need to think that, as myself, I follow a highly Eurocentric perspective when I check all this material, and it's also what I found in literature. But looking deeper, you can see that archaeobotany and indigenous heritage studies are really including now more studies that really look into the heritage, indigenous heritage, and are proving that the trades with plants and other goods among indigenous peoples in America is much more complex and occupies more territories that we have imagined until now. Well, also, I have looked at the conservation status of the species that are depicted in this beautiful collection, because these plants were most likely quite abundant in the 17th century. However, some of them are now decreasing in population and are also facing extinction, like the ones I show in this slide. And this is mostly because of habitat loss and degradation of the habitat, which happen in a great degree because of deforestation, intensive agriculture, farming, logging, and increasing of the urbanization, and of course, climate change. So this is something to look carefully. And I think it's important to have this material because it kind of gives us baseline conditions of how the environment, or which plants, which natural elements we could find at that time when it was still not that disturbed for high profit enterprises of early capitalist societies. Well, also, besides the origin of the plants and the conservation status, I have checked on the plant habit and domestication status. The plant habit is whether there are trees, shrubs, or lianas, or plants, or herbs. And the domestication status, whether they grow in the wild, or whether they have some degree of management by human population. So, well, to sum up the main findings, I found that these things differ among the collections. For example, the Teatrum has more trees that grow in the wild, in the rainforest, in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, while in the Libri Principis, there are also an important percentage of trees. However, most of them are domesticated, like the Carica, that you can see here, the illustration, which actually was domesticated pre-Columbian, domesticated by indigenous peoples. And also in the Libri Principis, there are many weeds, like the ones you can see, Comelina and Phaseolus, many weeds that grow along and that can be easily picked. And this is interesting because I read that some scholars are wondering whether the artists that depict this collection were pleasantly sitting around the vicinities of the Maurits estate and depicting what they could see in the gardens, or whether they actually went in expeditions and kind of took the risk to go more to the interior. So this shows us a bit of this. So for example, this is a plant that if you see the image, for me, at first I didn't tell me much, but because it's just the fruit of the plant. And when I identify it, I could see that actually it belongs to this liana, that you can see these beautiful flowers here, that grows very high trees in the rainforest. However, we see only the fruit in the illustration. We hear the two bulbs and then one open. So what happened is like this fruit fall in the ground, it open, and once it's open, the seeds that, as you can see in the image, seem quite fragile and light, they blew away with the wind, because that's the way they have to pollinate. So most likely, the person depicted took had just the fruit like that without the seeds, and it's because of they took it directly from the ground or a local person gave it to them. So that's why I look here at the parts that are depicted. And I also see differences because in the Teatrum, for example, there are more plants that are depicted with their branches showing their fruits, like the example here. And also their flowers, their reproductive structures, as you saw at the beginning with the example of Tapia. While actually in the miscellanea, we have many fruits that are loose, and which also makes sense because actually some of these illustrations were used later on by the painter Albert Eckhout in his still life paintings. I will show you an example of this at the end. Well, here I want to show you an example of the woodcut in Historia Naturalis Brasiliae. and its a correlation in the theatrum, because as some scholars have pointed out before, actually some of the illustrations in the theatrum may have served as the basis to elaborate the woodcuts that are part of the natural history treatises. So this is one of the cases. However, you can see differences like in the theatrum, this tuber, this big tuber, which is an organ to accumulate liquids, to accumulate nutrients for the plant to survive, is quite important. The same physician Piso actually described it in Historia, and they put it at the front of the illustration. This is often the case as well with the Orthus malabaricus, for example. In the Historia, however, it goes in the back. I want to read you the description of Piso, who say that its roots deserve special attention because of the way they develop underground and their use as a refreshment for feverish patients and exhausted travelers, as I experimented myself. So here, he was making a first-hand observation, as well experimentation, and already indicating the uses of the tuber. If I check how this is used today, I found that the fruit is actually more popular. It's an edible fruit. People eat it raw, or they make a Brazilian drink that is called umbuzada. However, to find the uses actually of this tuber, I had to go to more informal sources, and you are interested, you can check the link of YouTube that I give here, where actually there are local people that you can find in the areas where these trees grow, which are very, very arid areas in Brazil, semi-arid areas called sertão, and they show how they dig. They take the tuber, they open it, and they can extract liquid, they can extract water from it. So if you want to check more about the story of this tree and how local people use it today, I invite you to check the link. Like in these cases, sometimes you cannot see the uses or this kind of stories in academic or more formal sources, because after all, you are checking what people use, how they perceive the plants and their environment, and not everyone has access to the sources that we, for example, are using as academics. And well, first I was checking about the origin of the plants, and then about which plants, which parts were depicted, whether they were trees, whether they were lianas, the one here, for example, is a liana, etc. But then, because I saw that actually there were so many correlations between the visual sources, the Libri Picturati and the Historia, I start checking at this. And here you have an example. This is a passion fruit plant. You probably also know. There you have one of the copies of the Historia. This one is kept at the Leiden University Library. Here you have another one, and I bet you can already see differences in the coloration. There are only a few color copies in the world, and I'm going to show you here the ones I have access so far. So here you can see another copy with the white flowers and seed. This is also in Leiden, but in the Naturalists Biodiversity Center. And then we have here another copy, which is actually in Berlin. But this one has the flowers color like magenta, like more reddish, more purplish, which actually correlate better with the theatrum, with the illustration in the theatrum, and with the plant in nature. So I'm wondering why this is the case, and why most of the color copies have the flower in white, while this one in Berlin has it in red. And recently, I think I got into some clues, but I cannot go now into this detail because it will make it too long. But if someone is interested, it can ask me later on. So keep going with the woodcuts. Here we have another example in which actually the woodcut is not exactly the same. It's not the same that in the theatrum. So in the theatrum, they depict these beautiful fruits and some of them open, showing the details of the seeds, while in the Historia, they put a branch, it seems rather sad, showing some of the flowers. And the thing is, this fruit is highly used, it's reported in the Historia, like used by indigenous peoples who sell it to the Portuguese in the markets. This fruit was also exported to Europe, and they use it as dye, and it's still used. It's a very important heritage element in Brazil and in other parts, also the Amazonian and Latin America. So I wonder why actually the Lied choose to put the woodcut that in first sight has less quality, let's say artistically, than the one in the Teatrum. Then actually Piso, in the book that he made 10 years later, he took the woodcut that was in the Historia, and then he had another one. He probably thought in this case, okay, we didn't show the fruit is of great importance, I'm going to show it here. But he didn't use the one that in the Teatrum. He actually ordered to make a copy from the woodcut that Clusius used and in his Exoticorum Libri Decem in 1605. This branch arrived to Clusius, who never traveled overseas, because a collector of Naturalia in aristocrat Peter Garrett gave it to him. And he told him that the indigenous population were using it to color their faces, as they are doing today. And if you want to know more about this branch in Clusius, please follow Florik Egmont, because she made a very, very nice research about it. So here we start seeing these differences in woodcuts and wondering where they come from. Here you have another example. So you can see the illustration in the Teatrum. And actually, my supervisor Tinde was recently pointing me out about how out of proportion is the drawing if you compare with a plant in nature, which has very big flowers, and it has also kind of impressive fruits, but a bit smaller than the flower, and they're not together. Like you can see one of the picture, it can overlap a bit when the fruit is immature and has this funny shape with the point, but not when the fruit is more mature, as you can see in the left corner. And the illustrations show something else. Now, if we want to complicate ourselves even more, let's put all the color copies I have so far, and then you can see that actually they kind of resemble the Teatrum. However, here the fruits are smaller, and only in one copy there was no flower. In the others we have flowers, which I think were not engraved in the woodcut. I think someone painted later when they made the watercolors. You can also see the leaves in the Teatrum that are erased. However, they are presented in the woodcut. And then you have the same plant, the same species in the Miscellanea Clayeri, if you can see it there. And as I told you, this sketch was used later on by Eckhart, who painted in his still life. So you can see it there. And here you can see how actually the leaves are much larger and the proportions are more correct. And well, the thing that I'm seeing here is like also there's a lot of discussion about authorship, especially among art historian scholars. So maybe this can elucidate some insights into this, knowing that the Miscellanea was painted by Eckhart and checking at the differences in style and so on. Is it now? All right. So to end up, well, as you can see, this is a research that relies in intersection between botany, history, and art. And the aim of this study is mainly to add knowledge on the collection, exchange, and study of natural collections in the early modern period. I would also like to add a source of data for cultural, historical, and biodiversity research, for example, to understand ecological changes, but also to look more into the authorship. And I hope to highlight the relevance to preserve natural history collections and also to increase the access to a larger community, and as well to promote the collaboration of experts on several fields of study to obtain broader, different, and many times complementary outcomes. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And thank you very much for your attention. And please know that I have plenty of references. This research draws upon wonderful research that has been done before by botanists, by art historians, and I cannot cite them all here. However, if you want to check my paper, sorry, I'm doing a bit of self-promotion here, you can see all of them, and I really like to acknowledge them. So thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much, Mireia. That's absolutely fascinating, and it's particularly fascinating the way you've woven so many plant flows. Like, it's not just across the Atlantic; they've gone all the way around. I think that has been very interesting, and the way you've brought it up to date. We're not just looking and analysing a book, your one book of illustrations or two books of illustrations, but you're seeing how they're still used today, which I think is absolutely fascinating and well done. I'm sure lots of people have lots of questions, but before I open the questions up, can I just point out that Mireia has given us some references to some of her published work, which co-authored, and you'll find those in the chat box at some stage, either straight away or afterwards. So let us proceed immediately to the questions. Right. Sorry, Mireia, I've just lost, there we go. And this is a question from Alette. And she's, no, sorry, the question from Luisa Teixeira Costa. Fantastic talk, she says. As a Brazilian botanist myself, I'm very happy to see this fascinating topic being analysed in such detail. Congratulations. My question is, do the books you've analysed also contain textual descriptions of the plants? If so, are there any significant differences between the textual description and the image? Any dates, month and year of when the plants were either described or illustrated? That is her question.
Hello, Luisa, thank you very much. I'm really glad you like it. And yes, I have also checked the descriptions. Before, at the first steps of my research, I checked carefully at the descriptions, especially of the useful plants, the ones that were used as food, as medicine, ritual, and so on. And then I compare how these were used in the 17th century and how they are used today in Brazil. So I did this analysis. However, now that I'm checking at the visual sources, indeed, I'm more interested about the morphological characters that are in many occasions carefully described by Marcgrave, by the naturalist Marcgrave, no, in the book. So yes, for example, in the case of the passiflora, you can still see the illustration here. It actually describes the purple reddish colors that we can see in the image. So I was really wondering why they portray the others white. However, we also don't know if the person that did the watercolors could read Latin at that time, or if they had a model that they were following. Also, let me see the question again.
All right, there you are. So it's the matching of the textual description against the images. Have you found many differences? And also the second part was any dates of when the plants were either described or illustrated?
Yes. Well, so far, yes, I found some differences, but more with the colors. But I'm still working on it, because before I had 2 color copies, but now I'm getting more color copies, which is awesome. But I really need to systematize all the information and check, so I cannot draw conclusions yet. There are dates. There are dates and locations of the plants. The thing is, what they are doing, what especially botanist Marcgrave is doing, he's referring to dates when he's citing about the flowering stage of the plant, the fruiting stage of the plant. So you can see a bit of the ecology of the plant and the phenology, and that is highly interested. And actually, when I found out about that, I started noting that separately in a notebook, because I want to see if I can trace this phenology, and also if I can trace the locations. I can tell you some locations: Sergipe, Olinda, Ilha de Maranhão, and of course, many of them were presumably collected and depicted in Recife. But yeah, I really hope to tell you more about this in a near future, because it also sparkled my interest, the questions that you are actually giving me. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Stephen Radley would like to know who was buying the books and the art that you referred to. So do you know who was buying the books? Who bought the Historia or the Libri?
Yes, in general terms, they were used for many naturalists. For example, von Martius, German botanist von Martius, he was carefully checking at the book, and you can see in his work commentaries of Marcgrave Piso. Actually, he was checking the illustrations, and others were using them in the tropics, not only in Brazil, but in other parts of the tropics. So apparently this book, despite it's quite big in size, it was like a guide for botanists or people interested in natural history, to when they could go overseas to check for the plants, to identify them. Now, about more specifically, this is something that some of my colleagues are working, and also my promoter, Mariana Francoso, is working. So I can't step in this case, but I'm looking forward to see her results soon, and then we can discuss more about it, because it's highly interesting. I can tell you the name of one. It's Otto. I can't pronounce the surname. Can I go back with the slides?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't allow me. Yeah, it happened before as well. Where is it? Almost there. Yes, here. This is a copy that we have today in Berlin, and you can read there Otto L.B. Schneider, or I wrote it somewhere else.
Schwerin?
Yes. So he apparently was the counselor and minister of Frederick Wilhelm, the elector of Brandenburg. So that's why I said before that this book, he owned it, and the elector also owned the collection of illustration. No, they were part of his personal library, because he wanted to make this material accessible to the elite, or the people that were hanging with him, and the people interested in these matters. So, and this is actually the book that has the passiflora, the passion flower, with the reddish flower, which is the same that in the Theatrum. So I wonder that if Otto owned it, and it was at that time also with the Theatrum, they colored it after it. So they didn't color it immediately after publishing. I don't know. I'm sure there are in the room many art historians that can know better about this matter. So any insights will be also great.
Thank you. So Michael Ann is asking, please tell us, she says, about your research into why the passion flower is shown to be white instead of red in some of them illustrations, which you've sort of covered, really.
I'm glad it sparkled some mystery, some curiosity with the mystery. What's the idea?
Still to be explored. Alette is asking, you said briefly, did the artist botanist look at the plant itself or not? Some of the images depicted seem to be upside down. Is this correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you noticed. Actually, I noticed myself recently, because yeah, I'm very ignorant in these matters of art, and I love art, but is something that I don't see in the first hand. I see the species. But then I found out that indeed, where it is? Here. Indeed, I'm sure, you mean this one, with the shadows, you can see it. They are on top of the fruit. Interestingly enough, if you see at the Historia, there is a woodcut that correlates this illustration. Now, in this woodcut, how is depicted? The branch is still the same direction, but apparently they notice and they put the fruits like under it. But the branch is still like this. They just move the fruits because perhaps they noticed, no, they were the shadows, so they adapted to the woodcut.
So much to unravel.
So much, and that's the thing that for me, I started looking at plants, and then suddenly I came from the teatro or the Libri Picturati I was comparing that with the books, with textual sources, and now I'm comparing all the images in the textual sources with these sources, with the Libri Picturati, plus other sources that I'm finding in the way when I research more, like this woodcut of the Bixa, from Clusius. So it's just naturally going towards the woodcuts and towards other questions that I didn't have before.
Thank you. For Max, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm collaborating with Kew Gardens, and I'm curious to know whether you have also involved Kew in your research. Have you especially used or studied the large amount of dried specimens in the herbarium? We also have some of the plants you talked about in our collections. I can't pronounce this, Caricia, Gustavia, Passiflora, Beecher, and he says thank you again. So the question really is, how far, if at all, are you involved with Kew? And would it interest you, presumably to be interested with Kew?
Thank you so much, Max. I'm gonna read a bit the question because I'm not collaborating with Kew, but well, this is I'm open for collaborations, and is my contact there if someone needed. You have involved Kew? No, so far I haven't involved Kew.
To be followed up on. Another question from Leonis. Have the plant names changed since the book was published, i.e. they're now Linnaean names?
Have the names changed?
Have they changed since the HNB was published, or the Libri Picturati? The plant names have changed, presumably, or have they to Linnaean names? Have they been?
Yes, actually, when it was published, the Linnaean nomenclature, the binomial nomenclature that we know now, it didn't exist because it was always no Linnaeus back then. But since botanists were starting to work with the plants and identifying some of them, yeah, some names have changed. Actually, the identifications that I use for the textual sources, I have to be very grateful to botanist Johan Pico from Brazil, because in the 50s, he published an amazing, extensive work on all the plants described and depicted in the Historia. So my work was to review his and update those names that were outdated. So yeah, names change over time. They do change. And now with taxonomy and genetic and molecular analysis is something difficult to keep up, but it's something to be checking. What I found interesting about names is like Linnaeus actually was basing, he was naming the species, many tropical Brazilian species based in this book. That's why we have Tapia, is indigenous Tupi name, and we have Crateva Tapia, which he used as a species name. So this happened with many plants. He incorporated the indigenous vernacular names into the Western scientific nomenclatura. And this is something I would like to look further as well.
A question from Richard Colton, who thanks you for the talk. He asks you if you could say a bit more about the names that seem to be applied to the paintings in the theatrum. he's sorry if he missed you talking about this. Are they names collected from indigenous people? Do we know more about how the specimens were collected in terms of the involvement of European and or indigenous people in those activities? Two questions, really.
Yes, great. It's a very nice question. Actually, yes, the illustrations, many of them came with names, and most of them are from indigenous, the macrolinguistic Tupi family. It's a very complex linguistic branch that involves different languages. So in this time, they kind of simplify with Tupi, Tapuya. That was the Western perception. And I'm kind of also myself abbreviating as Tupi. So yes, there are many indigenous names, Tupi, and there are also African names. There are African names that sometimes apply to plants that were brought from Africa, like the case you have seen. There are also European names. So we have a mix. There are many Portuguese names. I think that the Portuguese were there a century before and for a very long time. So all this knowledge, all this mix have remained we can see them through the documentation of the names in the Teatrum and also in the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, where we can see actually more of them. So yeah, that's really interesting. And the other question was about the collection. Yes, the thing is, there are a few times where is some knowledge that indigenous peoples were using plants in some way or another, and they were observing that from them. However, sometimes the knowledge behind the knowledge is depicted as you write it. It's not an acknowledgement that, okay, we came here and we have learned or appropriate this from the local population. This is to say indigenous peoples, enslaved African, Portuguese, Sephardic Jews, and so on and so forth. So overall, there's not a clear acknowledgement, but you can really go in if you check deeper at the text and at the use, how the uses are described of the plants. Piso say as he experiment himself, but I bet Piso didn't adventure himself to go dig a hole, physician Piso, physician in court, dig a hole, take the huge tuber of the plant and open it and drink the water like a coconut without knowing that that could harm him or heal him. So there's of course an appropriation and a learning from the local population.
Thank you. Alette points out that the artist, when we're talking about the difference in colouring and things, could have been doing the plant right, but someone else may have made the mistake or misinterpretation when making a drawing into a woodcut. So
yes, indeed. That's very interesting because in some cases they're adding elements. If you check I'm talking for the ones that correspond with the Libri Picturati, with the Teatro. In other cases are taking elements out. So I would expect normally the person that do the woodcut takes elements out, so it simplifies the image. And that happens in some cases. In other cases, it's the other way around. They add more elements. So the thing is believed that there is a lot of material that has been lost, or is still in some archives that I'm not aware of, and other scholars that study the topic. So it's difficult to tell, but yes, actually in the second edition of Piso, you can see how he modifies some of the woodcuts and how the wood engraver, the woodcut person, I don't remember how this is called in art history, but another piece to add some details and so on. So sometimes that's why they differ from the illustration in the Libri Picturati.
Great. All right. Michael Ann asks if you have any thoughts about the image on the cover of the Historia Naturalis, the nude native couple in the foreground and the people dancing in the background.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's a representation of the Adan garden, Adan and Eve garden, isn't it? There is many stories. Rebecca Brienen, Parker Brienen, she's a Brazilian art historian, and check on her because she's doing amazing work. From an art historical perspective, I have learned a lot from her. So I think she has something in her book and some of her works about the cover.
I think, if I'm right in saying, it's not too dissimilar to one of John Parkinson's books. I think there's a picture slightly in the same vein on the front of that. I may be wrong. Anyway,
you're right. Yeah, I will check it. I will check it because the thing is, these books probably also they were highly copied in different works of natural history since the 17th century onwards. So I would not be surprised. I mean, this was kind of the thing, to copy one another. And Max, sorry, before the question of Max about Q and herbaria, I'm actually also working with the herbaria of Marcgrave that is in Copenhagen. So if we could communicate by email or something about this, I would be very happy to answer properly his question.
Okay. And your details are there on the screen, aren't they?
Yeah, the same for everyone, please.
Excellent. Good. I think that's rather a good question to end on. So I'd like to thank you once again, Mireia, for so generously giving us your time and for leading us through such an intricate and fascinating subject. Many, many thanks. And before we all say goodbye to each other, can I just remind everyone that the next seminar is in 2 weeks' time, on the 4th of November, when Christopher Pastore from the University of Pennsylvania will be discussing the Venetian interest in Moorish Spain and its impact on 16th century Italian gardens. So thank you very much, and we would hope to see you all then.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Mireia, and thank you all very much for coming. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.